I'll let her introduce herself, and if she wants to start sharing her slides, we could, but yeah.
Sounds good, thanks. So yeah, again, I'm Ingrid. I'm a grad student at NYU studying chemical engineering. The exact focus of my PhD thesis is studying nanomaterials for renewable technology, which I'll get to in a second. But yeah, I'm really excited to be here. And yeah, Carla's gonna help me out with the screen share since, yeah, I'm not sure what's going on my laptop, but we'll make it work. But today I'm going to talk about how I'll introduce a bit of my research and why I got into studying renewable technology as a chemical engineer myself, and how this really informed the work that I've been doing outside of the lab. So in the past couple of years, in addition to my research, I've spent a lot of time doing a lot of community work with March for Science, which is a volunteer network formed in 2017, which I'll get to a bit more, but really trying to see how scientists can use our skills, like from data analysis to our communication skills, delivering technical talks to broad audiences, so on and so forth, to organizing and community building. All right, Kylie, you can go to the next one. So this is really important to me because for chemical engineers, I think what really influenced me going in was like really not thinking about sustainability, frankly. I think when I was like an undergrad deciding what career I wanted to go in, it was very like, I like math, I like chemistry, I like physics, I'm going to study chemical engineering. And I was very like consumer product driven, thinking about, like pharmaceuticals, or in chemie, really the kind of, I don't want to say it's like the most valued job, but like the most lucrative career that people think of is like going into oil and gas and going into the energy industry. But when I got to do my research, I started to think of more about like, what are the materials that are going into these consumer products that we're thinking of? How much energy is required to actually do these processes and manage waste and all that in a laboratory? And that really informed the kind of career focus that I wanted to have going forward. So in the last couple of years, I really went from a very like traditional chemie track to thinking more about like how we can use the same principles of chemie that brought us oil and gas, but is now, frankly, not just poison and terrible for everyone, but also outdated technology, and thinking about the energy that we consume and how we can innovate in that area. Okay, Carl, you can show. Yeah. So one important thing was like thinking about how we actually create and use energy. So most of our energy right now, I think like no surprise, comes from non-renewable resources. So oil, gas, and coal. There is like a growing sector that's dedicated to low carbon energy, so like renewables and nuclear, but it's still a small subset. So Carla, if you go to the next animation, regardless though of like what energy input we use, right, there's always this conversion. We have like our, like I think like traditional like chemistry, like A plus B gives us C. But whenever that happens, Carla, if you hit next, right, that's when we get this work out. So we have like our source, we have some conversion process, and we get energy out. That comes like the form of electricity that we use in our day-to-day lives, whether it's doing transportation or lighting up our rooms. So when that actually happens, Carla, if you hit next, unfortunately, a large amount of energy that we use in these processes is like waste heat. So every time we generate, like 1 mole or like 1 joule, sorry, I should say, of energy, a large amount of the energy that we actually put in, whether it's biomass or oil and gas, we burn this energy, it comes out as waste heat. And Carla, if you hit next, where chemical engineers, including myself, have really been innovating is thinking about, developing new materials that can be more sustainable, B, tackling this issue of like, can we harness this waste heat and turn it back into usable energy? Or yeah, can we increase the efficiency of these processes? Yeah, Carla, sorry, you can go ahead. And in particular, what I've been interested in my research is tackling this issue when it comes to lighting. That's because lighting consumes a significant amount of the electricity that we use globally, and a significant amount of greenhouse gas emissions. And at the same time, while these numbers might not seem as large as other sectors, right, there's still over 1 billion people worldwide who don't have access to reliable lighting. The good news is, though, is that solid state lighting, or LEDs, as you might be familiar with them, have really innovated the way that we think about energy issues in the last couple of decades. So there's been like a large shift to like, you know, like there's like fluorescent bulbs, incandescent light, which requires like a lot of, if you're had them growing up in your house, you might remember like how hot those bulbs get. And that's usually like, that's kind of like a sense of like the waste heat that's coming out of these processes. But LEDs, because of their semiconductor nature, kind of sidestep those issues. So whereas we're going from like mechanical energy to electricity, now what we have are these transitions, which is a solid state transition. So it's kind of skipping the need for that mechanical work. So it's kind of the same if you have like a solid state hard drive versus like you might be used to like your computer fan whirring, whereas you have a solid state hard drive, you kind of skip that part. It's the same kind of phenomenon here. And what actually happens is like when you pump electricity into an LED, what happens is like these volts pump a lot of electrons into like this excited state. So these electrons are basically ready to flow. And when you have a certain, if you recall, like between like valence band and conduction band, basically excited state and ground state of an electron, when you, if Carla, if you hit the next animation, if you release the energy between a certain difference, what you get is a certain emission of light. So like if I have something that's like a certain band gap, they call it, that difference, I'll get a different color wavelength of light, like high energy being purple, low energy being red. And then Carla, if you hit next. Yeah, go ahead next, sorry. And what that means is that basically what we can do is with LEDs, we have the power to like tune a wavelength of light. So the light color of light that we're getting based off this like width of the band gap. There's still like inherent deficiencies that come with this. Like it's not, I shouldn't say it's like perfect, right? Compared to like previous ways we light things, but the efficiencies are still generally high or high enough for us to function. And then Carla, you go next. Yeah, and then usually comes just, these are like, this is where like the material selection part of things comes in. So if you have materials that, basically this comes to, it's a bit like in the weeds, but looking at the crystal structure of materials, basically their skeleton, their inherent number of electrons that they have will tell us what kind of defect properties they'll have. So it's kind of like, it's like, it always reminds me of like when you have like a road to like your to-do list, right? There's like a task that you just need to complete. These trap states or things that cause like deficiencies in solid state processes are kind of like distractions like on the way there. Like instead of just going from like just completing the task, it's like, oh, I forgot to like do my laundry, forgot something in the dryer. And it kind of like removes your energy throughout the day until eventually like maybe you'll get to that point or you won't. But at any case, it's like with less efficiency than you would normally have done it. Carla, you can go ahead. So what we work on is looking at, again, I mentioned before, like nanotechnologies. So right now, LEDs to address these issues. So LEDs right now, like the state of the art is made from these like bulk crystals. When I say bulk, I mean like basically like big rocks, like chunks of like basically periodic structures that have like a lot of electrons and crystals to contribute to their optical properties. But when you go to nanoscale, what you're doing now is kind of like playing Legos. So like nanoscale is like on the scale of where we can just about like play on the atomic level. So what's really nice about that is like when you're going this small, you can kind of think about it like if I have like a wood block, for example, right? And I want to make a smaller wood block, the intuitive thing would be like cut the wood block in half. And now I have a smaller wood block. If I want to go further, I would just keep cutting and cutting and cutting it, right? But with nanocrystals, if we take this like so-called like bottom-up approach that I'll introduce more in a second, it's kind of the opposite. Now it's like, okay, let's say I want to make something that behaves like wood, but instead of starting from a wood block, I have like all the pieces of pulp or like a material that I could assemble like wood to play with. And that's really powerful because now it's like, maybe if I start from the bottom up, it can overcome the defects that inherently exist in wood to begin with, if that makes sense. So what this looks like in the lab is just like it's cooking, basically. So it's basically like I stand in the fume hood and we have like our metal salts in a broth, which is just like a chemical mixture. We heat it up and stir it over time to like just kind of like mix, like making soup. And eventually what happens is when you inject material A with material B, we get these nanocrystals out. So Carly, I think if you hit next, Yeah, it looks basically just like soup, but rather than getting soup out, Carl, if you hit next, you get these small nanocrystals instead. And what's really powerful about this is if you change things, just like the way, like if you change like the ingredients that you start with, or the amount of ingredients that you put in soup, or the time and temperature that you cook something, you change like your end product. So here I have these small, cute little square particles, but you can get spheres, you can get hexagons are really common. You can get different shapes, and basically depending on those shapes and sizes, again, it goes back to like what actual like optical properties you measure, how it affects like the light that they can emit and absorb. And what's really cool about this is because we're doing things on bottom up and it's in solution, it's relatively inexpensive compared to taking these like bulk materials that exist that tend to be compounds that are made from rare and expensive elements. And also because it's solution based, a lot of people are looking at actually like printing these materials. So rather than having like an inkjet printer that like prints out like, you know, like papers and text, you can actually like print something onto like semiconductors to like make wearable technology and stuff like that. Carly, if you hit next. And the reason it's called quantum goes back to what I was showing before. So if we recall like this jump between like the conduction band and valence band, I never thought about this in chemistry, like taking it in high school or early college, but this idea of band is because it's like actually like many electron states like that are close together inside, very close together to the point where they overlap. But what happens because we're at the nanoscale now, we're at the same scale as like, you know, electrons, protons, we can see things more clearly. So what actually happens is instead of having these continuous bands, we actually have these discrete energy states. And this is why for these materials, we can actually, Carla, if you hit next one more time, I think we can tune, yeah, the particle size of these particle size of these nanocrystals, and then it changes the size of that like band gap I had mentioned before. So one analogy, if you're someone who like wears like heels, is kind of like a small particle is like a kitten heel that has, a large particle might be something like a kitten heel that like, you know, like relatively like low maintenance to wear. You could like wear it for the whole day, like easy to manage. Whereas something that's like high energy, like wide band gap, might be wearing like stilettos that like requires like a lot of energy and time and effort to wear. It's kind of like a night out. So like we can correlate that like band gap to like the size of what we are looking at. And then Carla, if you hit next. So what's really exciting is that people have done this with like pretty high efficiency. These are pretty bright. So this is like a solution of like one particle system that we've just grown for a longer amount of time. So again, like the shortest amount of time would have like the highest energy. So it's like a tiny particle, blue light. If I grow it for, let's say, an hour longer, I'll get an LED from the same particle, but now it's a bit larger and we get red light. And then Carla, if you hit next. And it's actually like the same technology that they're using now. If you've like kept up with like Samsung and like QLED TVs, this is like actually like how the pixels are controlled. So it's like individual particles of different sizes that emit different wavelengths of light. And then, so that is like basically what my thesis research is about. And even though it's a bit removed from, I think, directly with organizing, thinking about energy systems in this way, like, you know, like I have this great technology in the lab that we're really innovating. What does that mean outside? And, you know, like in the last couple of years, energy issues have really become like enter the public consciousness thanks to the youth climate movement. Even though this work we know has been going on for decades, they've really brought it on to the mainstream. And really since like this IPCC report came out in the last year, and then Carla, if you hit next, and then, yeah, as we know, with just like recent events, even like in 2020, with everything else going on and COVID itself being a symptom of this like extractive nature that like energy tends to take. So thinking about my research in that context of like, you know, these are really cool innovations, but again, like what materials are we looking at? What is the end life cycle of these LEDs we're trying to innovate? And like, what does it mean when it comes to addressing these larger scale issues of the climate crisis are kind of like the two realms where I try to like organize my brain. And then Carla, if you go ahead. And this is what motivated me to kind of take my work out of the lab and start to really first be vocal So March for Science began as like a movement in 2017 that was really just like a reactionary day to most immediately to the election of former President Trump, but overall really about just I think like a lack of regard for science is that a lot of scientists were feeling as a community, like constant budget cuts, constant like misinformation campaigns being spread, whether, like about like vaccines or climate change, all of that. And really coming together as a scientific community. And then Karliki hit next. And taking that momentum that was built that day and taking it to actually like get out in the public and start to build community around what it means to be a scientist. Which as a grad student was really important to me. I think at a time this happened like my first year of grad school when I was like similarly like struggling to like really find my place. I think like what my work was going to mean and find community like within science that didn't feel like it was like isolated in the lab, just like publish these papers, whatever, but really like commit ourselves to building solutions with our communities. And then Kyle, you go ahead next. And for me, that really, I think it's a bit of a journey to get there, but part of what really helped. Sorry, my phone just froze. Okay, sorry, my phone just froze for a second there. Was really, I think as a grad student, like, so I jumped into March for Science as a day. And then over time, it was kind of like me and my friends started doing work. Then we added another friend, so on and so forth. Well, we really started to realize like a lot of scientists were interested in getting involved with us, but we weren't sure as we weren't sure like what they could actually commit to. And for us, it was kind of like this like soul searching period of, like as scientists, we have expertise that is incredibly specialized and valued, whether you're solving issues directly related to climate or you're tackling like drug delivery issues or understanding, the local like water in your community and taking that knowledge and looking at where we can share it and where it can be used best. And then thinking about, like the actual time and that we can commit to these things, but also, and as grad students, this doesn't hit as hard. This is like a talk that I gave also outside, but what resources we can like monetarily give or find through our institutions, especially who have the ability to either divest or invest in these initiatives to go forth. And then Carla, if you go ahead. And then from there, it was about thinking about, this is not a graphic that I drew, it's from Sunrise Movement, but thinking about like what people's niches as organizers are. I think this is like another thing that I struggled with a lot, like as a scientist, like coming into an organizer space, thinking about like, okay, I have these, like I stand in the fume hood, I know how to make these chemicals, but I don't know where my skills really lie outside of that. But this really amazing Sunrise graphic really broke it down very well. And hopefully what I'll do is like translate to like how this relates to like the work that we do in the lab. So Carla, I'm sorry. I know like this is a series of animations. You can feel free to click through them and I'll walk through them one by one. But basically, like in our lab, everyday lives as lab teammates, we communicate our information to our PIs, to our fellow grad students, sometimes to the general public or to people outside of our field. We are coordinating lab meetings, we are, as doing our thesis, really, I think maybe it doesn't sound as exciting as action lead, but we really are at like the forefront of and pioneering knowledge often, right, in the fields that we're doing. And I think that takes a lot of courage that maybe isn't the same exactly as like, running provides like a similar
I think Ingrid got lost. We lost Ingrid, but
Lost her again. Low-key, does anyone know, like on the right corner, it says, like above Virgo, it says doesn't believe in astrology, but definitely an ISTJ or a 5. That's a personality test. What does a 5 mean? Man, you guys know.
I wanted to ask someone the same thing.
It's an Enneagram number. So
You did that before, right?
Number.
Yeah.
It's another, it's just another personality thing.
Okay, sorry, my phone decided it's on the same boat as my computer, but like I'm back. Where was I? Yeah, sorry. But yeah, basically trying to communicate, like these skills that we have, whether it's managing collaborators or, like the day-to-day work that we do, which is like managing data, communicating this data to some audience can really, take us out from just like processing traditional lab data, but we can use these skills, like to our everyday lives, basically. Yeah, Carly can get to the next one. And then I think the most important thing was like trying to find a group or build that community around, which I think is like where groups like March for Science, AFSA, 500 Women Scientists really lend a lot of grad students and just like people in general, a lot of motivation to do this work. But I think the most important thing, Carla, if you tell once, is that this can really be lent anywhere. So in the city, right, we've been having these like community fridges that have been popping up. There's like local elections that are always happening, or even, especially if you're a grad student, organizing your workplace, thinking about like your grad student union or housing issues, and basically being, I think it's like, I frame it as like being as annoying as possible with the skills that I have, that really like, I think like causing good trouble in that way. Like, something that like we did as March for Science was aggregate like housing data at NYU and try to see like where basically commute time versus rent versus the safety that students felt and what the grad student stipend actually offered, and being like, like we are supposed to be like valued at school as like scientists, trainees, all of that, but this is like the actual reality we're living in, and then bringing those conversations basically to like challenge the way things that are done within the scientific community by using like ironically the skills that we have built through our time. But yeah, that is basically it. So hopefully, I know there were a lot of tech issues, but hopefully things got across, and thanks Carla for helping out with the slides.
Thank you so much for that talk. That was so good. Very nicely ties in community organizing with your PhD thesis. So very impressed. Yeah. Now it's open to questions. So if anyone has questions, feel free to speak up.
I have a question. Hi, Ingrid. Great talk. Your work is really, really cool. I would love to see, I'll keep tabs on that kind of technology as we kind of move forward. That's really interesting. I wanted to ask you, from your second to last slide with the lend your skills with the 5 different personalities, I wanted to ask you what you think you are. So I'm already trying to think like who I fit into as one of those, but like what skills do you lend to that movement of, getting science out there, and how do you kind of embody that in your training?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if I thought about it that deep before myself. I feel like I started out as like a comms person. I really got into, this is a bit of backstory, I think, but I really actually got into grad school because I wanted to pursue science journalism after grad school, and thought that like, like getting into actually like firsthand experience of like doing science would be like what informed me about basically covering this beat. But what I found instead was just that I really loved and enjoyed the storytelling aspect of science, whether it's like, sharing my paper or talking about this work. But then I think in the years since, I've transformed into host. I feel like I'm definitely the person who's like running around trying to like facilitate things as much as possible. I think that's also like a symptom of like, I don't know, it's a symptom, but also a part of just like having to run the back end of like an organization. Like for me, even though I really enjoy the storytelling aspect of things, I think even as a journalist, it's because I always wanted to put like other people's voices, like uplift that rather than like center what I was doing. And like I feel like as a facilitator / host, that's where I've been able to do that by badgering volunteers, basically. Yeah, thanks, Jess. I didn't think about it that too much in the last couple months.
It's a good thing to think about though, because I'm like now thinking about it, and I feel like I fit a couple here and a couple there, but not one full role. But I took a screenshot of that because I thought that was really interesting, and I kind of want to think about that a lot more as I do things in my PhD.
Yeah, for sure. I think the one thing that for me, and I feel like it was that's why I was like, which one am I? Is because I feel like I've tried to do everything, but I know that like, I mean, even I know I'm like a senior grad student, but I personally like hate thinking about like how to manage my data. Like I know that's not something that I enjoy doing. It's just like part of my day-to-day job to like process these spreadsheets. And then I think like playing in all these different roles and seeing what you like takes time is important.
I think Fred has a question.
Yes, I did. So yeah, I think as more and more events like occur, that like it becomes more clear that climate change is real. If people aren't already awake with that, I mean, there was the snowstorm in Texas, the wildfires in California, those like many typhoons in the Philippines. But yet there's like still pushback for reasons because a lot of energy companies want profit. So, I mean, I know they passed like laws in like Arizona that you can't get rid of gas companies, and then they're trying to make those like kind of that pushback against people doing the work to advocate for climate change. So I'm just curious what your outlook is of like what kind of response is is warranted for that pushback, because the companies are not going to give up like oil, gas. They're not going to
Yeah,
stop.
for
So
sure.
I'm curious.
Yeah. It's something I've been learning about like so much late, especially what happened in Texas, like how deeply entrenched like oil and gas companies are like into our infrastructure. There's this great book that I read called Short Circuiting Policy by Leah Stokes, who's a political scientist, I think at UCSB. And pretty much it's kind of like the best advice I could give. And I think what's needed is like fighting fire with fire. Like these companies are just so well organized. I like hate to say it because it's the same things that, like I hope to like achieve with like what the work that I'm doing with March for Science and within the scientific community. But there just needs to be that kind of, I think, fire behind that movement. Like I feel like the youth climate movement was so powerful because they were so visible. But then at the end of the day, it's like that back end work of like, these are the people who are the important power players like in your state, in your city. And that's like where the buttons need to be like pressed. And I feel like if there's no accountability there, then it doesn't like scale all the way up. If that makes sense. 'Cause tackling, yeah, like ExxonMobil is like like a very scary thing to think about. But talking to, like your local municipality about like where, like what local investments they can make, or like public power solutions, for example, is a way that those things can like happen over time.
Yes, I agree. Bring power to the people again.
I want to say thank you to Ingrid, especially for coming here and like talking. Just a background, I actually knew Ingrid because AFSA wanted to collaborate with March for Science for their Earth Day back in April last year, and then the pandemic happened and everything. And I think it's really great to like reconnect and make that discussion again about like climate action. I guess like I do have a question as well, and I think like Ingrid kind of touched on it on her like presenting the research and her organizing. I want to ask, how do you manage it? Like, because I feel the same way with like, yeah, it feels like my research is quite different from like, it's kind of like detached to what's actually happening around the world. And so like there's a lot of like motivations that's different between the two kind of worlds that I'm in. So yeah, I want to ask that very broad question, if you could share some light.
Yeah, for sure. I'll say like in the beginning, it was definitely difficult. I feel like especially when, I mean, like two times, especially like first, like when Trump got elected, I feel like that was a very hard time. I was like, I just started grad school and I was like, what am I doing? Like there's so much going on that I was starting to learn about. And then during COVID, I think it was like especially difficult to feel motivated, particularly around research, because I was like, I really don't need to be in the lab. But for me, what it came down to, and I think a lot of this like soul searching has really happened like during last year, the pandemic, was like knowing what my role, or I shouldn't say knowing, like defining what I want my role as like a scientist to be. Like I know that in the spaces that I organize outside of lab, that my voice as a scientist is like really what's valued, and kind of sometimes I don't want to say like lends credibility, because like I really do believe those community voices are what also needs to have that value, but that's where my space and like kind of like where my voice is coming from, if that makes sense. So that kind of has been like a motivation for me, like knowing that I'm representing my community in that way, like from the community side in the scientific side back. And I think the important thing that I really had to learn and force myself, honestly, was just like setting boundaries. Like I just had to be like, I'm here from this time to this time. And then so on, because I feel like both things, like being an organizer and being a grad student, lend themselves, unfortunately, very easily to burnout. And I feel like at some point, especially during COVID, it just like wasn't sustainable. And I had to just be like very strict with myself. Like, you know, like this is like only so much that I can do. And after that, it's about like trusting the people around me to like do as much as they can, which I know sometimes, especially if it's like March for Science, it's like with my baby, was like hard to do in the beginning. But I think as like you build community, it kind of becomes like easier to like find people to do that with. Hopefully that was helpful. It's like an ongoing thing.
Yeah, it helps a lot. I think, yeah, like everyone here might be able to like relate, but AFSA is also, you know, came from a very, yeah, like different place back then, and then how it grew and how we have been trusting each other, and that's kind of helping us, you know, like look after each other and the work we do outside of the community. So thank you, Ingrid. Anyone else has a question?
Can I ask a quick question?
Mhm.
Hi, Ingrid.
Yeah.
I had a question about like from March for Science. Like, how did it go from like a one-day event to then becoming global, and how do you maintain that, I guess, that momentum? Because
Yeah.
I see your social media, and it's like you said, it's on fire. But I imagine that like it took a lot of like hard work to get to where it is now.
Yeah, that's a great question. So actually, so between the first March for Science in 2017 and 2018, like I can say like in the city, like our small group that had started organized together, we actually spent a lot of time like publicly like silent, really doing like a lot of internal work. And I think that's because when March for Science happened, I think this happens with like any like large movement, is like there's an overall broad mission, which in March for Science's case was like science for the common good. But you know, like organizing really, I think like a theme like happens at like the local scale, and what it means to like organize in New York or even New York City is very different what it means to organize in like Texas or California or anywhere else. So we spent a lot of time just like having a lot of internal conversations, and honestly it was very frustrating because, you know, like a lot of everyone comes in with like different ideas, but at the end of the day it's like about like what that broader mission was, and then deciding like, you know, like this is what March for Science is like in the city, and then just having that be like the guiding light. Like I feel like every time we don't know what we're doing, we feel overwhelmed, it's like, does this add to the mission, or are we just like arguing and like making it hard on ourselves and for each other? And then from there it was slow. We started, I think like the most important thing was like understanding the capacity. When we were a small team of like 4 or 5, it was just like, you know, from one event to like maybe one event per semester. Then after that, it was like, you know, slowly we get build momentum that way. And then from there, it was about, I think, finding to that same graphic I shared earlier, like, especially like within science, like knowing that everyone doesn't have, I mean, knowing that everyone has different skills that they lend, and then finding people who do those things well. Like, especially for us, like communications was a big thing, like finding people who can like manage social, for example. Like that's something that like, you know, we probably do in our personal lives and have an understanding of like how our unit or like our institutions do it, but what it means to like actually have that presence, and like finding people over time to do that. And then from there, it's just like, I think we've fallen into this like built this cycle that works really well of like knowing again like how much we can do in a certain amount of time, and then also giving us space to like be apart from each other, have a break, and all of that, because otherwise, yeah, we've run into times, especially in the beginning, when we really wanted to keep momentum up and thinking we were like keeping the fire going, but then just like burning out very quickly.
That's awesome. Thank you. That's really helpful.
Yeah, I think Austin, to your point, it's about, yeah, not creating followers, but like more leaders, like finding where everyone, I feel like in my role, and Omar, who's like my co-chair, was really to find people that we could really uplift and then have them flourish and so on and so forth.
Well, Ingrid has very good insights and advice for AFSA too. And I like, yeah, I'm glad that, yeah, you give this talk. So Kumasan is officially over. It's 7:30 here, but you guys are welcome to stay if you want to chat more. But